Well, good morning, honoured guests, colleagues, historians. Welcome to this year's History Conference. It's a rare honour to stand for the second time this year in the Great Hall of Parliament House, the home of Australian democracy, and to talk today with all of you about our army, our nation's army. Just over a year ago, I stood in a different hall at the Chief of Army Symposium in Melbourne and spoke about the human face of battle and the state of the army profession. And I posited at the time that the history of the Australian Army shows a clearly defined pattern, a sine wave of professionalism, if you like, which creates challenges for us as the stewards of our army and of the army profession today. The Australian Army has tended to reach the apogees of our profession in times of war. And it is in these periods of great need that the weight of the nation, morally, physically and spiritually, have pressed the profession forward. The World Wars were particularly seminal. And as the great Jeff Gray records in his history of our army, World War I was the making of the Australian Army. In just 4 short years, the first AIF became the mainstay, or a mainstay, of the British Empire armies. Its initial single division and mounted brigade in 1914 growing rapidly to 7 divisions, fighting in 2 theatres of war. The popular image of the Australian soldier was that of the talented amateur, the bush soldier. But in reality, no army could have endured the horrors of the Western Front without, as Gray put it, the attributes instilled through discipline, training, leadership, sound doctrine, which together constitute thorough military professionalism. This professionalism again reached a peak when the Second World War cast its shadow just 2 decades later. The Pacific War was the gravest test ever faced by the Australian Army, and indeed by Australia as a nation. The passage of time has faded our sense of its gravity, but put simply, the situation in 1942 was nothing short of dire. The Imperial Japanese bombing campaign against Australia was a ruthless design of attrition and pressure. In just the first raid on the 19th of February 1942, Japanese aircraft dropped 115,000 kilograms of explosives on Australian soil, 2.5 times the number of bombs and 83% of the tonnage released on Pearl Harbor. The Allied position in Southeast Asia collapsed in a matter of months. The Japanese advance drove back the combined weight of the British, Indian, Australian, Dutch and American forces. The loss of Malaya, the fall of Singapore and the surrender of the 8th Australian Division were national catastrophes. The damage done to Australian trust and confidence in their army was significant. The danger of an invasion of Australia, as Blamey himself assessed it, was very serious. In the face of the greatest threat in Australia's history so far, the army profession rose to the occasion. Fighting on our own doorstep and mostly from our own resources, we had no choice but to evolve a comprehensive profession with Australian characteristics. From March of 1942 and onwards, we developed our own doctrine, expanded our schooling and training enterprise, designed a flexible command and control system, and discarded social barriers to female and Indigenous service. We proved remarkably able to acquire and bring into service new and innovative equipment, including no less than 1,900 watercraft, operated by the Royal Australian Engineers, and the decisive deployment, against all conventional wisdom, I would add, of Matilda tanks into the jungles. This ability of the army profession to adapt and harden the force for the crucible of littoral warfare, intellectually, technically, and spiritually, proved decisive in the victories in the Pacific theatre. The same can be said for Korea and for Vietnam. The army profession has been at its best when the nation has needed it most. The same cannot be said, however, for the interwar periods. Here sits the other aspect of the pattern of the army profession, the troughs that form the sine waves of challenges. The interwar periods have routinely seen the army profession contract and at times even come close to collapse in the face of irrepressible human optimism, underinvestment, and the demands of competing national priorities. This pattern was first seen in the aftermath of World War I. This had, of course, been the war to end all wars. And a war-weary and indebted Australian nation came to believe that military affairs would no longer be consequential. While both permanent and militia soldiers felt the impact of this perspective, it was the permanent cadre, most often the custodians of the profession, who felt the brunt the most. By 1931, the headcount of the permanent army was just 1,515 officers and enlisted ranks. The Royal Military College Duntroon class of 1930 had only 12 subalterns, and indeed the college was temporarily closed and its functions moved to Victoria Barracks in Sydney. Compulsory training for the militia ground to a halt, and equipment and doctrine atrophied in the face of the rapid industrialisation and mechanisation of wars occurring elsewhere around the globe. The final result was that the Australian Army of 1939 was less militarily capable than it had been just 2 decades earlier in 1919, despite the unmistakable signs of a second impending war. This same pattern struck in the aftermath of the Second World War. The Army post-war plan, submitted in September of 1946, predicted that an approach wholly reliant on militias and mobilisation would not keep pace with world affairs nor the changing character of warfare. It recommended a significant standing army that was by nature both relevant and credible, consisting of a permanent division, 2 part-time divisions capable of deployment within 3 months, and a further 2 divisions that could be ready within a year. But again, a nation sick of war, optimistic for peace, understandably, and perhaps ignorant of history, was averse to bearing the cost of such a force. Financial constraints turned a division into a brigade, and by 1950 the regular army was less than 15,000 strong. This was despite the ongoing demands of both the occupation of Japan and, in short order, the fierce fighting of the Korean War. From Gallipoli to Kokoda, Kapyong to Longtan, and to the modern battlefields in Afghanistan, the sinusoidal pattern has repeated. Interwar contraction and at times atrophy, followed by the rush to expand in the presence of a threat to our nation's prospects and security. Well, why does this matter so much to our army today? Well, because the interwar contraction has always incurred two debts. Firstly, a debt of time, and secondly, a debt of lives, soldiers' lives. Contraction has meant that it has always taken time for the army profession to rise in the face of the next foreseeable and indeed inevitable crises. In the First World War, this debt was found in the 2 years it took for the First and Second Anzac Corps to be ready to contribute to the decisive theatre of the war, the fight against the German army on the Western Front. In the Second World War, this debt of time was twofold. Found firstly in the hasty raising of the Second AIF for the initial campaigns in Europe and North Africa, but then again in the wholesale transformation of the army for the defence of Australia and the brutal jungle fighting of the war in the Pacific. The debt of time is inevitably accompanied by the debt of lives. It is to the nation's enduring credit that in 1914, 44,000 citizens volunteered to join the AIF in just a matter of months. But when they deployed to Egypt, they did so almost entirely untrained. There was only so much that could be done to address this before the beaches of Gallipoli called, and over 600 young Australians paid with their lives on the first day alone. In the Pacific, the debt of lives was paid by those tasked to hold the line against the Japanese while the army and the nation were preparing for Australia's territorial defence. The debt was paid by the remnants of the 8th Division, by the isolated soldiers of the bird forces, by the independent commando companies, and by the militia battalions who fought and fell in the initial battles of the Kokoda Track. Their courage and gallantry was unmistakable, and just last week we stood together, as we do every year, to remember their sacrifice. But as soldiers and as the stewards of the army profession today, it is our obligation to do all we can to prevent such loss in the future. It is our moral obligation as well as our professional obligation. Both the Defence Strategic Review of 2023 and the National Defence Strategy that emanated from it are clear, very clear, that we no longer enjoy the luxury of warning time. As I noted in Melbourne a year ago, a conflict in our region would constitute an immediate threat to Australia and its interests. It would demand an army profession already prepared for a comprehensive response, one that is relevant and credible against the threat, hardwired for continual adaptation and able to match the emerging character of any regional war. If we are not ready, the debt of time will almost certainly incur the debt of lives, and this is simply not acceptable. To once again paraphrase my 1950s predecessor, Sir Henry Wells, we must never again be in a situation where soldiers have to be killed for us to learn. So we must strengthen the army profession. We must strengthen our profession now. We must do all we can today to reduce the amplitude of that sine wave that is evident in every interwar period. In short, we must be ready for the prospect of war today. Today's gathering is important in this regard. And in 1993, Professor Sir Michael Howard advised military professionals to study history in width, in depth and in context. And so in the program today, Tim and the team from our esteemed Australian Army History Unit have drawn together a remarkable grouping, a host, if you like, of historians, academics and thinkers to help us study the Army profession in just this way. The Deputy Chief of Army, General Chris Smith, will lead us off by considering the role of history in our understanding of the realities of war and warfare and the professional dangers of neglecting the study of our history in the past. We then shift into one of the most important pillars of our profession, that of self-regulation. I think you'll be fascinated by Major Sam White and Sergeant Norman Demaringu when they take us firmly beyond the day-to-day, examining the traditions of Indigenous conflict resolution through the long arc of our history. They'll be followed by Colonel Jim Waddell and Dr. Bob Hall, who will lead us on a trek through military discipline in the Army profession, both in the history of the military justice system and then in the applied experiences of the 1st Australian Task Force in Vietnam. We'll then be treated to an exploration by Professor Craig Stockings of our professional body of knowledge. Now, Professor Stockings will not only examine the history of the role of education in the Army profession, importantly, he will also propose, and I might add has been actively involved in where we intend and ought to go next. He will be well supported in this by Dr. Jordan Beavis, who will examine the history of the Australian Army Journal, often a litmus test for the health of the profession, and Dr. Darren Moore, who will take us out of our comfort zone in an examination of our past and the bastardisation, or the matter of bastardisation at the Royal Military College, Duntroon. Lieutenant Colonel Luke Carroll, Dr. Justin Chadwick and Colonel Rich Bushby will collaborate to help us understand how well we have adapted in the past, and indeed where we've failed to do so. The 1976 Regular Officer Development Committee and Project Opera in 1998 provide valuable case studies for adaptation, as does post-World War II, or the post-World War II Pentropic experiment. Dr. Jason Seaton, Dr. Jeanette Bomford and Dr. Kate Ariotti will take a deep dive into the integration of women into the Army profession, starting with the Second World War and ending with a call to action for better scholarly history of the experience of women in our profession. The day then ends with a broad arc across professional ethics, the relationship between the Army and the society we exist to serve, and the changing strategic role of the Army in the post-Vietnam period. I'm very grateful to the stellar lineup of Professor Bob Breen, Dr. Nicole Townsend, Dr. Tristan Moss, Professor John Blaxland, and Professor Mike Evans, all of whom will help us in this endeavour. And so today we study our history. And I ask that you do so focused not so much on the past, but with a very keen eye to our future. As Winston Churchill said in March of 1944, the further backwards you can look, the further forward you are likely to be able to see. Professor Mike Evans' abstract for today is correct that at times in our nation's history we have risked becoming an army without a strategy and a strategy without an army. This cannot be the case today as our nation faces the most challenging strategic circumstances in generations. We must be clear-eyed about our strategy and sharply focused in its execution. We are obliged to buck the trend of the sine wave of our history. The strength of the Army profession will be central to our success the next time we are called upon to defend our nation. The time is now, and it's on us, the current stewards of our profession, to lead the way. Thank you. Thank you to Tim and the Australian Army History Unit team for putting this year's conference together, and thanks to all of you for your contribution, your focus, and the application of the thinking, the work, and the understanding of our history in ensuring that we can buck the trend of the sine wave of the interwar periods and ensure that we can deal better this time with the debt of time, and in doing so, do our very, very best every day to reduce the debt of lives, the debt of Australian soldiers' lives the next time we are called to fight. Thank you.